In a boardroom filled with skeptical stares, Thaddeus Cross, an ambitious black pilot, boldly declared his dream to become a billionaire and own Skyline Air. But can his vision rise above the deeply rooted prejudices and challenges in an industry ruled by the elite? This incredible journey will leave you speechless. The Skyline Air boardroom was a space of luxury, but it exuded an unyielding chill. The long conference table, draped in pristine white linen, was flanked by rows of sleek leather chairs. On the walls hung paintings depicting the history of aviation, images of propeller planes and pioneering pilots, all of them white men. Those paintings served as a silent reminder of the industry's long-standing exclusivity, as closed off as the men seated in this very room. At the head of the table sat Benjamin Langston, an investment billionaire with neatly combed silver hair. His sharp, cold eyes seemed capable of piercing through the ambitions of anyone who dared step into this space. To Benjamin, Skyline Air was not just a company. It was a symbol of supremacy, a legacy built by and for men like him. The boardroom doors swung open. Thaddeus Cross entered with a commanding presence. His tall frame, clad in a perfectly tailored black suit and a neatly knotted tie, radiated confidence. Each step he took echoed through the silence, and the tension in the room thickened as every gaze locked onto him. They looked at him as though he were an intruder. Benjamin Langston's lips curled into a faint smirk, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. As Thaddeus approached and stood at the end of the table, Benjamin broke the silence, his voice low and laced with derision. "Thaddeus, you think you can own this airline?" The question lingered in the air, a challenge embedded in every syllable. No one in the room believed that someone like Thaddeus, a black pilot, could achieve such a feat. Thaddeus stood firm under the weight of their scrutiny. He met Benjamin's gaze head-on, his eyes unyielding. His voice was steady, each word deliberate. "I don't think," Thaddeus replied, his tone resolute. "I know I will." The room fell silent once more. A few men exchanged skeptical glances. Others let out faint, mocking chuckles, their disdain thinly veiled. Seated near Benjamin was Jared Monroe, Skyline Air CEO. A middle-aged man with a polished but cold demeanor, Jared leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. To him, Skyline Air was an untouchable heritage, and people like Thaddeus had no place within it. Jared raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a disdainful smirk. He leaned forward, scrutinizing Thaddeus as though examining a foolhardy dreamer. "This industry has existed long before you, Cross," Jared said, his voice icy. "And we won't let outsiders destroy it." Thaddeus didn't flinch. He took another step closer to the table, his gaze sweeping across each person in the room. In that moment, he no longer saw powerful billionaires, only the towering walls of prejudice that had stood for far too long. And he knew he was here to tear them down. "You're right," Thaddeus replied, his voice calm yet cutting. "This industry has existed long before me. But if it doesn't change, it will collapse." His words made a few men sit up straighter in their chairs. Jared Monroe leaned back, his arms crossed again, his expression unchanging. But Benjamin Langston tilted forward slightly, his fingers drumming against the table, his curiosity piqued. Thaddeus drew a deep breath. He wasn't here to seek their approval. He was here to deliver a message, a declaration of intent. He locked eyes with Benjamin, unwavering. "Aviation belongs to everyone," Thaddeus stated firmly, his words striking like hammers against the fortress of conservatism. "And I will make that a reality, with or without your consent." The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. No one spoke, but their eyes said everything. The men seated at the table saw the fire in Thaddeus's words, a fire they could not easily extinguish. Finally, Benjamin Langston broke the silence, his voice low and laden with meaning. "You've got fire, Cross. But don't forget, the skies aren't easily conquered." Thaddeus didn't respond. He held Benjamin's gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked out of the boardroom. The boardroom door of Skyline Air closed behind Thaddeus Cross, but the mocking words of Jared Monroe and Benjamin Langston still echoed in his mind. This industry has existed long before you, and we won't let outsiders ruin it. Thaddeus walked slowly down the long hallway of the Skyline Air building. The glass walls reflected his image, a man standing tall and resolute, though a storm of emotions churned inside him. He stopped near a window, his gaze fixed on the endless blue sky outside, where planes were constantly taking off and landing. Those iron birds reminded him of a childhood dream, a dream he had never allowed himself to abandon, even at the cost of isolation and enduring scornful stares. Thaddeus closed his eyes. Memories surfaced. Detroit, 1990s. Detroit, a city of factory workers, but also a place where dreams were suffocated by poverty and prejudice. The streets where Thaddeus grew up were littered with trash and riddled with potholes. The old buildings looked ready to collapse at any moment, and the wail of police sirens pierced the air every night. It was a place where black children's dreams were often crushed under the weight of harsh realities. In the cramped Cross family apartment, Harold Cross, Thaddeus's father, came home from a long shift at the factory. His dark blue work uniform was stained with grease, his hands calloused, and his face etched with exhaustion. Harold was a quiet but strong man, carrying a deep faith in God. He often told Thaddeus that faith would guide anyone steadfast in their dreams. In the corner of the room, Janie Cross, Thaddeus's mother, folded clothes with nimble hands. She worked long hours as a waitress at a small diner, standing on her feet for most of the day just to earn a meager wage. Yet, despite her weariness, her eyes always softened with love and hope whenever she looked at her son. One evening, 10-year-old Thaddeus stood by the small apartment window, staring up at the sky. Planes streaked across the heavens, leaving long white trails behind them. He stood mesmerized, his young eyes filled with wonder. Even at that tender age, Thaddeus knew what he wanted: to become a pilot, to command those giant machines, to soar beyond the invisible boundaries society had drawn for him. Harold Cross walked over to his son, placing a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "Watching the planes again?" Harold asked, his deep voice warm. "Yes," Thaddeus nodded. "I want to fly them, Dad." Harold was silent for a moment, then crouched down to look his son in the eye. "Do you know how hard that will be?" he said, not to discourage his son, but to prepare him for the difficult road ahead. "I do," Thaddeus replied, his voice unwavering. "But I'll do it." Harold smiled, pride glimmering in his tired eyes. "God always lights the path for those who have faith and determination," he said. "Hold on to your dream, Thaddeus. One day, you'll soar higher than anyone." But even as a child, Thaddeus understood that the color of his skin was a heavy barrier. At school, he often heard the whispers behind his back. "A black kid dreaming of being a pilot? Yeah, right?" Those words cut deep, like knives, but Thaddeus refused to let them break him. Instead, he turned them into fuel. One evening, Thaddeus stood by the window again, his eyes following the planes as they crossed the night sky. In his mind, the taunts replayed, the voices of classmates, neighbors, even adults who dismissed his dream as impossible. But Thaddeus clenched his fists. A silent promise ignited within him. "They say I don't belong in the sky, but I'll prove them wrong." The memory dissolved, pulling Thaddeus back to the present. He still stood at the window of Skyline Air, his gaze fixed on the planes taking off and landing in an unending rhythm. Benjamin Langston's words echoed in his mind, a warning wrapped in cold detachment. "You have talent, Thaddeus. But in this industry, talent isn't always enough." Thaddeus drew a deep breath, unfazed by the cautionary tone of those words. A thought rang clear in his mind. This isn't just about me. It's about the kids growing up in poverty, about the people who've been told they're not good enough, not capable enough. I will change how the world sees who belongs in the skies. His fist tightened, and a fierce determination blazed in his eyes. He would not let prejudice or barriers hold him back. He would own the skies. As Thaddeus prepared to leave the building, a voice called out behind him. Benjamin Langston had stepped out of the boardroom, his sharp eyes fixed on Thaddeus, a faint, knowing smirk playing at his lips. "You have talent, Thaddeus," Benjamin said again, his voice low and layered with meaning. But in this industry, talent isn't always enough. Thaddeus turned, his unwavering gaze meeting Benjamin's. A small, confident smile touched his lips as he replied, his voice calm but cutting. "We'll see." Benjamin stood there, thoughtful, watching as Thaddeus walked away from the building. He saw a man carrying a dream far larger than himself, with the unshakable resolve to make it a reality. Thaddeus knew that greater challenges lay ahead on his journey, but he also knew that to own the skies, he would have to shatter the barriers that had stood for far too long. That morning, sunlight streamed through the towering glass panels of Chicago International Airport. A Skyline Air Boeing 787 sat poised on the runway, ready for its commercial flight to New York. It was Thaddeus Cross's first flight of the week as first officer, but he knew the real challenges still lay ahead. The cockpit of the Boeing was spacious, yet stifling with pressure. Control panels blinked with countless indicators, their lights pulsing in rhythm, while the steady hum of the communication system filled the air, creating a tense but professional atmosphere. Thaddeus sat in the right-hand seat, his eyes meticulously scanning the control panel. He had grown accustomed to double-checking everything. He couldn't afford any mistakes. For him, even the smallest misstep would be magnified into an excuse to discredit his place in the skies. The cockpit door swung open. Leonard Blake, a veteran captain, stepped in with an air of authority. In his early 50s, Leonard had sharp, graying hair, cold, piercing eyes, and a face set in perpetual sternness. He was a revered figure at Skyline Air, a man celebrated for his extensive flight experience and decisive demeanor. But Leonard was also known for his rigid views, harboring the belief that cockpits were reserved for men like him, white men. Leonard paused at the door, arms crossed over his chest, his icy gaze sweeping over Thaddeus. "Cross," Leonard said, his deep voice laced with sarcasm. "I heard you had quite the tense meeting with the board." Thaddeus didn't turn around, keeping his focus on the control panel. He knew Leonard's comment was meant to provoke him, but he also knew that composure was his greatest weapon. "Yes, Captain," Thaddeus replied evenly. Leonard stepped further into the cockpit, setting his captain's hat on the console, his stare boring into Thaddeus. "I don't understand why you think you're special," Leonard sneered. "Don't forget, I'm in command here." Thaddeus clenched his fists under the console, but his face remained calm, betraying no emotion. He was no stranger to such remarks. "I can't lose my cool," he reminded himself. "I've come too far to be derailed by men like him." Relaxing his hands, Thaddeus responded, his voice steady and measured, still focused on the instruments. "Of course, Captain. Passenger safety is my top priority, and I respect the chain of command." Leonard's lip curled into a faint, derisive smile, as though Thaddeus's reply had failed to satisfy him. "Safety, yes," Leonard drawled, "but safety requires more than staring at numbers. It takes experience, and more importantly, it takes not making mistakes." Leonard settled into the captain's seat, adjusting his uniform before turning to face Thaddeus. "And I'll be watching closely to make sure you don't make any." Thaddeus remained composed, but he could feel the invisible wall of prejudice Leonard was building between them. "They don't believe someone like me can belong in the skies. But I won't let them stop me." His father's words came back to him. "God lights the path for those with faith and determination. Hold on to your dream, and no one can stand in your way." As the plane began taxiing to the runway, a warning beeped repeatedly from the control panel. A minor error message lit up on the display. Leonard noticed it, but made no move to address the issue. Instead, he turned to Thaddeus, his eyes full of challenge. "Handle it," Leonard said, folding his arms. "Show me what you've got." Thaddeus nodded, his hands moving swiftly over the controls as he analyzed the data and pinpointed the issue. "It's a cabin pressure problem," Thaddeus said after a moment. "I'll adjust the ventilation system to stabilize it." With precision and efficiency, he executed the necessary adjustments. The beeping ceased, and the warning light disappeared. Leonard remained silent for several seconds, still watching him intently. Finally, he smirked. "Lucky," Leonard said dismissively. "But don't let it happen again." Thaddeus didn't respond. He knew that to men like Leonard, his successes would always be dismissed as luck, while even the smallest error would be blown out of proportion. But he also knew he didn't need Leonard's approval to soar. As the plane lifted off the runway, climbing steadily into the sky, Thaddeus sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the vast blue expanse stretching endlessly before him, free and boundless. Leonard Blake's gaze remained fixed on Thaddeus, filled with doubt, as though waiting for a mistake to confirm his prejudices. But Thaddeus saw something entirely different, a future where the skies belonged to everyone, regardless of the color of their skin. "We'll see," Thaddeus thought. "I don't need to prove myself to him. I'll prove it to the world." Thaddeus knew the journey ahead would bring greater challenges. But he also knew that to tear down the walls of prejudice, he would need to hold on to his faith and determination, because the skies belonged to those bold enough to claim them. Thaddeus clenched his fists tightly, drawing in a deep breath to steady himself. Prejudice was a familiar adversary, one he had faced countless times, yet it never failed to leave invisible scars etched deep within him. The soft sound of high heels clicking against the cabin floor pulled him back to the present. Alyssa King, Thaddeus's attorney and business partner, strode down the aisle with an air of calm confidence. She wore a tailored business suit, her hair swept into a neat bun, and carried a slim folder in one hand. Stopping beside him, Alyssa fixed her sharp yet warm eyes on him, her gaze filled with quiet encouragement. Alyssa always had a way of showing up when Thaddeus needed her most. "Another issue?" Alyssa asked gently, her tone soft but tinged with understanding. Thaddeus didn't respond immediately. He gave her a small nod and turned back to look out the window. Alyssa stepped closer, her voice steady, carrying an undeniable weight of belief. "Not everyone is ready to change," she said firmly, her words laced with emotion. "But you're doing the right thing. Don't give up." Her words resonated in the stillness, like a balm for wounds he had long endured in silence. Thaddeus looked up at her, his hardened expression softening. The invisible injuries caused by prejudice seemed to fade, slowly mended by her presence and unwavering trust in him. "There are days," he admitted, his voice low and reflective, "when it feels like I'm fighting a battle I can't win. People like them, they don't want to change. They can't stand the idea of anyone else but themselves owning the skies." Alyssa smiled faintly and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "But that's not why you're doing this, is it?" she asked. "You're not here to prove anything to them. You're doing this for those who don't have a voice, for the kids whose dreams are crushed under the weight of harsh realities. That's why you're here." Thaddeus was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. Alyssa's words rekindled the purpose that had driven him this far, reminding him of the reason he had started this journey in the first place. "I won't give up," he said firmly. "I'll keep going, not because I need to prove anything to them, but because I know this is the right thing to do." Alyssa's gaze shone with pride. "Then keep going," she said. "Don't let them see you falter." Thaddeus straightened, taking a deep, steadying breath. Her words had reignited his resolve, filling him with renewed strength. Turning back, he walked slowly toward the cockpit. The door opened, and he took his seat as first officer. His hands rested firmly on the controls, his gaze fixed on the expansive sky ahead. "The sky remains vast and full of challenges," he thought. "But I know this is where I belong." Leonard Blake glanced at him over his shoulder, his eyes still clouded with doubt and suspicion. But this time, Thaddeus paid him no mind. He was ready for whatever came next. In his heart, a clear and unwavering thought echoed. "I can't change how they see me overnight, but I can change this world, one flight, one small step at a time." Soon, Thaddeus would face a midair crisis, a test of his skill, composure, and leadership. Would he rise to the occasion and prove that the skies belong to everyone, or would prejudice remain the barrier keeping him from soaring higher? Thaddeus's journey was just beginning. The Skyline Air Boeing 787 sliced through a dense layer of clouds, sunlight streaming through the windows in golden streaks. Inside the cockpit, everything seemed to be running smoothly, at least for now. In first class, The atmosphere was thick with power and arrogance. Skyline Air's top investors lounged in their plush leather seats, glasses of fine wine in hand. Men in expensive suits traded words about billion-dollar deals, ambitious market expansions, and staggering profit margins. No one paid attention to the world beyond the windows, where the clouds churned and rolled like a restless ocean. Richard Mathers, the man whose earlier remarks dripped with prejudice against Thaddeus, sat at ease. His legs crossed, a glass of red wine swirling in his hand. He exuded confidence. "We'll close the deal by next week," Richard said to the man seated beside him. "Skyline Air is becoming the most elite brand in the industry." The other man chuckled in agreement. "With leadership like this, nothing can stop us." Suddenly, the plane jolted violently. Richard's wine spilled, staining his pristine white suit a deep crimson. The metallic clatter of objects echoed through the cabin, a sound like distant thunder. A piercing alarm shattered the air, its shrill cry emanating from the cockpit. Red warning lights flashed urgently, signaling an emergency. The automated system's cold, emotionless voice filled the space. "Warning, cabin pressure loss. Warning, cabin pressure loss." In first class, the once imposing investors were now stunned and panicked. Their composed facades crumbled. Some fumbled to fasten their seat belts, while others scrambled for oxygen masks with trembling hands. In the cockpit, Leonard Blake gripped the controls, but his hands were shaking. Beads of sweat poured down his forehead, trailing down his strained face. His eyes darted to the control panel, where the readings were chaotic, flashing numbers that signaled imminent disaster. The plane was losing altitude rapidly, and the alarms blared without respite. Leonard reached for the radio to contact air traffic control, but static hissed in response. "We're losing control," Leonard shouted, his voice cracking with panic. I can't steer the plane." Thaddeus Cross, seated in the co-pilot's chair, remained focused on the erratic readings before him. His mind worked quickly, analyzing the crisis. The plane was experiencing a rapid loss of cabin pressure. The ventilation system was malfunctioning. If cabin pressure wasn't restored within minutes, everyone on board would perish. While Leonard spiraled into hysteria, Thaddeus stayed calm. He understood that this moment was critical. Hundreds of lives depended on what happened next. Thaddeus lifted his head, his steady gaze locking onto Leonard. "If we don't act now, everyone on this plane will die." Leonard turned to look at him, his eyes betraying a mix of confusion and helplessness. He hesitated for a moment, then gave a weak nod, as if finally conceding the undeniable truth. He could not handle this situation. Thaddeus stepped forward, his movements deliberate, and gripped the controls with unwavering confidence. "The cabin is losing pressure," Thaddeus murmured, his hands moving swiftly across the control switches. "We need to descend immediately." He quickly disengaged the autopilot, taking manual control of the aircraft. Dropping altitude to 10,000 feet, he instructed himself, his voice steady, low, and commanding. Thaddeus's hands moved deftly across the controls, adjusting the cabin pressure and ventilation systems. The piercing alarm began to subside, though the situation was far from resolved. He grabbed the intercom, his voice clear and reassuring as it filled the cabin. "Crew, prepare for an emergency situation," Thaddeus announced, calm and firm. "We'll be landing in 10 minutes. Stay calm and follow procedures." His voice echoed throughout the plane, a beacon of steadiness amidst the chaos. In first class, panic rippled through the passengers. Richard Mathers gripped the armrest of his seat, his wide eyes fixed on the small screen in front of him flashing the emergency status. "What the hell is happening?" Richard demanded, his voice trembling as he turned to the man beside him. "Are we going to crash?" Around him, other passengers scrambled to tighten their seatbelts or reach for oxygen masks in frantic desperation. Then, Thaddeus's voice sounded again over the intercom, deep, calm, resolute. "Everything is under control. We'll get you to safety." The first-class passengers sat upright, their faces still tense with worry. Yet, as they listened to Thaddeus's steady voice, the panic in their eyes began to fade, replaced by a fragile sense of trust and hope. Richard sat silently now, his gaze shifting to the window. For the first time, he realized that the black pilot he had scorned earlier was the one saving his life. In the cockpit, Leonard sat frozen, his hands still trembling. He watched Thaddeus manage the crisis with a mix of disbelief and shame. You actually know what you're doing, don't you? Leonard stammered. Thaddeus didn't turn to face him. He simply replied, his voice firm and unyielding. Yes, I do. The Boeing 787 began to descend smoothly, the cabin pressure gradually stabilizing. Passengers could now breathe more easily without the need for oxygen masks. Thaddeus adjusted the controls with precision, his eyes focused intently on the instruments before him. Altitude stabilized, he reported. Cabin pressure restored. He turned to Leonard, his gaze steady and unwavering. We need to make an emergency landing at the nearest airport. Leonard nodded silently, no trace of resistance in his expression. He understood that Thaddeus had just saved everyone on board. With the situation under control, Thaddeus straightened in his seat, taking slow, measured breaths. But deep inside, he knew the fight wasn't over. He glanced out the window at the boundless blue sky, stretching endlessly beyond. I've proven them wrong this time, but the journey is far from over, and I will see it through. The Skyline Air Boeing 787 hurtled through the skies, but now everything in the cockpit was firmly under Thaddeus Cross's control. The alarms had fallen silent, cabin pressure stabilized, and the plane descended steadily and safely. Through the thinning clouds ahead, the runway of Denver International Airport came into view. Thaddeus remained focused, his hands gripping the controls tightly, his sharp eyes monitoring every reading on the dashboard. Each movement he made was deliberate, precise, as if he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times before. Stay calm. Get everyone down safely. That's the only goal. The wheels touched the ground, screeching against the tarmac with a long, echoing friction. The Boeing 787 slowed gradually, leaving dark streaks on the runway. When the plane came to a complete stop, the cabin erupted in applause and relieved sighs. In first class, the once composed VIPs jumped to their feet, their claps blending with murmurs of gratitude and disbelief. Richard Mathers, however, remained in his seat, his hands trembling as he gripped the armrests. His gaze stayed fixed on the cockpit door. The man he had dismissed earlier, judged solely by the color of his skin, was the very one who had just saved his life. Passengers whispered to one another. We're alive. It was the co-pilot. He's the one who brought us down safely. To them, Thaddeus was no longer an anonymous black pilot. He had become a silent hero, the man who ensured their survival. As the VIPs disembarked, their usual air of superiority was gone. Wrinkled suits, loosened ties, and fear lingering in their eyes betrayed the gravity of what they had endured. Richard Mathers walked slowly down the aisle, his eyes scanning for Thaddeus. When he saw him standing at the cockpit door, Richard paused. He looked at Thaddeus for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod, one filled with meaning. For the first time, Richard's gaze carried respect and admiration. Other investors followed, their glances at Thaddeus similarly quiet, contemplative, as if they had just witnessed something that fundamentally shifted their worldview. Once the passengers were gone, the cockpit grew still, but Thaddeus knew his battle was far from over. In the distance, Jared Monroe, CEO of Skyline Air, approached the plane. His polished navy suit fit perfectly, his gleaming leather shoes clicking softly on the tarmac. Jared was a tall, lean man, with sharp features and an air of calculated control. He embodied the old guard of aviation leadership, staunchly traditional, fiercely resistant to change. As he neared Thaddeus, his expression was cool and composed, no longer tinged with open disdain, though a faint undercurrent of condescension lingered in his tone. You did well, Thaddeus, Jared said evenly. But I hope you understand that owning an airline is an entirely different matter. Thaddeus met Jared's gaze directly, his eyes steady and unflinching. He stepped closer, keeping a respectful distance but asserting his presence. "Do you know why I do this?" Thaddeus asked, his voice calm yet piercing. Jared raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. "I don't do this to prove anything to you," Thaddeus continued. "I do this for the kids whose dreams are suffocated by invisible barriers. I do this for people like me, people who are told they don't belong in the sky." Jared's lips curled into a faint, skeptical smirk. "You really think you can own these skies?" Jared asked, a trace of mockery in his tone. Thaddeus nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I don't just think," Thaddeus said firmly. "I know I can, and I'll prove that a black man can do more than fly a plane. He can run the entire operation." Jared studied him for a long moment, his sharp eyes searching for cracks in Thaddeus's resolve. "We'll see," Jared said finally, before turning and walking away, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. Thaddeus stood motionless, watching Jared's figure disappear into the distance, toward Skyline Air's executive building. A clear, determined thought echoed in his mind. "They may doubt me now, but with every flight, every decision, every action, I'll change the way they see this world." Thaddeus returned to the plane, his hands resting once more on the controls. His gaze turned outward, fixed on the vast blue sky ahead. Beyond the window, the sky stretched endlessly, waiting for those bold enough to conquer it. Though he had saved the plane and earned the respect of some investors, Thaddeus knew the road ahead remained treacherous. The resistance from Skyline Air's leadership would be fierce. Would he be able to tear down the walls of prejudice and become the man who truly owned the skies? Or would the power struggles of the industry consume him? Thaddeus Cross's journey was far from over. Thaddeus Cross's old car rolled through the streets of Detroit, the city where he was born and raised. It hadn't changed. The worn-out buildings, dusty roads, and dreams suffocated by poverty and prejudice. But this time, Thaddeus had returned with a different purpose. He wasn't here to look back on his past. He was here to change the future. In a small room in downtown Detroit, Thaddeus stood before a group of young people. The space was modest, furnished with old tables and chairs, but on the table lay important documents for the Freedom Flight Initiative, the program Thaddeus was building. The Freedom Flight Initiative wasn't just an organization. It was a mission. It was a nonprofit program aimed at training pilots and providing scholarships for young people from underserved communities, those who never believed they could touch the sky. Before him sat about 15 young men and women, most of them black, their eyes a mix of curiosity and hope. They were here because they had heard of the pilot who saved hundreds of lives on a Skyline Air flight. Thaddeus stood tall, his gaze sweeping over the eager, expectant faces. He thought of his younger self, a boy standing at a window, dreaming of airplanes soaring through the sky. "Today," Thaddeus began, his voice deep and steady, but carrying a quiet intensity, "we're not here to talk about barriers or challenges. We're here to talk about opportunities." He walked slowly to the table, placing a hand on the stack of Freedom Flight Initiative materials. "When I was young," Thaddeus continued, his eyes meeting theirs, "I didn't have anyone to guide me. No one told me that someone like me could own the skies." The room fell silent. "But today, I want you to know that the sky doesn't belong to just a few people. The sky belongs to all of us." The young faces looked up at him, their eyes filled with awe and possibility. In those eyes, Thaddeus saw hope. Hope that they too could one day claim the sky. A young man, around 18, wearing a worn jacket, stood hesitantly. His hands were clenched, as if summoning all his courage to speak. "Mr. Cross," he began, his voice uncertain, "do you really think someone like us could become pilots?" Thaddeus stepped toward him, his expression full of understanding. "Not just pilots," Thaddeus said, placing a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder, "but people who own the sky." He turned back to face the entire room. "The Freedom Flight Initiative will open doors that were once locked tight," he said firmly. "We'll provide scholarships. We'll help you access pilot training programs. And most importantly, we'll help you believe in yourselves." Applause erupted, breaking the quiet tension in the room. The young people clapped, their faces lit with newfound faith and determination. The Freedom Flight Initiative wasn't just a program. It was a symbol of hope, a declaration that the skies belong to everyone, regardless of race or background. As the group began to leave, Thaddeus remained in the small room, standing alone. He gazed out the window at the bright sunlight streaming in. In his heart, a thought resonated. I can't change the world in a single day, but I can start here with every young person, every small dream. And together, those dreams will take us farther than we ever imagined. After founding the Freedom Flight Initiative, Thaddeus Cross knew his journey was far from over. There was a larger mission ahead: to transform Skyline Air, a company synonymous with conservatism and exclusion, from the inside out. If I want to change the skies, I have to own the skies. Thaddeus made a bold decision. He would buy Skyline Air. But to achieve this, he needed the support of major investors. Over the following weeks, Thaddeus traveled across the United States, attending meetings with investors big and small. From expansive boardrooms in New York to modest offices in Chicago, Thaddeus sat across from investors, presenting not just a business plan, but a vision. He didn't focus solely on profits. He spoke of transformation. Aviation has existed for over a century, Thaddeus said during one meeting, his voice steady and persuasive. But for most of that time, it's been an exclusive industry reserved for a select few. He scanned the room, meeting each investor's eyes with piercing intensity. This isn't just an investment. This is an opportunity to create a more equitable aviation industry, where anyone, regardless of who they are or where they come from, can belong. Some investors were intrigued by Thaddeus's vision. They saw that the aviation industry was aging and in need of reinvention. But others remained skeptical, dismissing his dream as overly ambitious. In a meeting in New York, veteran investor Martin Delgado shook his head after hearing Thaddeus's pitch. "You've got a big vision, Cross," Martin said calmly. "But do you really think the aviation industry will accept that kind of change?" Thaddeus's gaze didn't waver. "I don't expect immediate acceptance, but I know change is necessary. And if no one else will do it, I will." As Thaddeus knocked on one door after another to secure funding, Jared Monroe, Skyline Air's current CEO, kept a watchful eye on his every move. In his luxurious office at Skyline Air's headquarters, Jared sat at his desk, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows. On his desk lay a detailed report on Thaddeus's plans. His expression was icy. Jared understood that if Thaddeus succeeded in acquiring Skyline Air, the entire system he and others like him had built would come crashing down. At a Skyline Air internal meeting, Jared addressed Thaddeus's ambitions with thinly veiled disdain. "Thaddeus Cross thinks he can transform the entire aviation industry with some fanciful dream," Jared said, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room. "But aviation doesn't change just because someone dreams it will." He leaned forward, his tone resolute. "This is a closed industry, and it will stay that way." Days later, at an investment event, Thaddeus and Jared Monroe came face to face. Jared approached Thaddeus, his sharp eyes fixed on him, a sly, mocking smile playing on his lips. "You did well on that flight," Jared said smoothly. "But you need to understand, flying a plane and running an airline are two entirely different things." Thaddeus maintained his calm, his gaze unwavering. "Do you think I don't know that?" Thaddeus asked quietly. "I understand it better than anyone." Jared crossed his arms, his expression challenging. "This industry doesn't change, Cross," Jared said firmly. "It's been this way for over a century, and it will stay that way." Thaddeus stepped closer, his eyes steady and resolute. "You don't see it yet," he replied. "But you will." Jared raised an eyebrow, as though he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Change is inevitable," Thaddeus continued, his voice low but brimming with conviction. "The skies don't belong to any one person or group. They belong to all of us, and I will make Skyline Air the symbol of that change." That afternoon, Thaddeus Cross sat alone in a small cafe in New York, his eyes fixed on the bustling streets outside. His fundraising journey had proven far more difficult than he had anticipated. While many investors expressed interest in profits, none truly believed in his vision. I need someone with influence, someone willing to stand by my side, Thaddeus thought to himself. At that moment, the cafe door swung open and Benjamin Langston walked in. Benjamin Langston, a seasoned billionaire investor, had once been the first to doubt Thaddeus's capabilities. But after witnessing Thaddeus's heroism during the Skyline Air flight, he could no longer deny that Thaddeus had accomplished what no one else dared to attempt. Benjamin sat down across from Thaddeus. His sharp gaze softened with a hint of respect. "Cross," Benjamin began, his deep voice steady. "I used to think you were just a skilled pilot." Thaddeus raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "But now I see," Benjamin said, leaning forward. "You're a man with vision. And I don't want to stand on the sidelines while you turn that vision into reality." Benjamin pulled out an investment contract and placed it on the table in front of Thaddeus. "This is the first investment," Benjamin said firmly. $50 million. It'll get you closer to acquiring Skyline Air." Thaddeus looked at the contract, then back at Benjamin. "You really believe in this?" Thaddeus asked, his voice calm but tinged with emotion. Benjamin nodded and extended his hand. "We'll do this together," Benjamin said. "Not just to own Skyline Air, but to transform the entire aviation industry." Thaddeus grasped Benjamin's hand, his eyes glowing with determination. "Thank you," Thaddeus said. "I promise, we'll make history." A week later, at Skyline Air's headquarters, a special shareholders meeting convened to discuss the future of the company. In the expansive boardroom, wealthy investors sat around a long table draped in white linen, their eyes filled with curiosity and skepticism as Thaddeus Cross entered. Jared Monroe, the current CEO, sat at the head of the table, his cold gaze following Thaddeus's every move. The tension in the room was palpable, like a taut string ready to snap. The predominantly white shareholders had never imagined that a black man like Thaddeus could stand before them, presenting a plan to take ownership of Skyline Air. But Thaddeus was unfazed. He stepped up to the polished oak podium, placed his hands on the gleaming surface, and began to speak. "Skyline Air has existed for over a century," Thaddeus said, his voice deep and resonant. "But in those 100 years, it has become a symbol of exclusivity and resistance to change." His gaze swept across the room, meeting each shareholder's eyes. "I don't just want to own an airline. I want to build an industry where anyone can fly, no matter who they are or where they come from." He paused, letting his words sink into the charged silence. "The sky doesn't belong to a chosen few. The sky belongs to all of us." At first, the shareholders remained silent, their expressions still guarded with doubt. But as Thaddeus continued to outline his vision for the Freedom Flight Initiative and his plans to expand Skyline Air, their expressions began to shift. Doubt gave way to intrigue. Some even began to nod in agreement. "We've been doing things the old way for far too long," Thaddeus said. "It's time to change how people view the aviation industry." As his presentation concluded, Jared Monroe stood, his cold eyes scanning the room. "This is a bold dream," Jared said evenly, "but I don't believe it can become reality." He turned to address the shareholders. "We'll take a vote," Jared announced. The vote began, all eyes fixated on the large screen displaying the results as they were tallied. When the final result appeared, the room fell silent for a moment. Then a single clap broke the stillness. Others followed. Applause rippled through the room, growing louder and more fervent. Thaddeus Cross had done it. He was officially the new CEO of Skyline Air. Thaddeus rose to his feet, his eyes drifting to the expansive window overlooking the sky. That sky, once a distant dream, now belonged to him. Benjamin Langston stepped beside him, a faint smile on his face. "We did it," Benjamin said. Thaddeus nodded, his gaze resolute. But this is just the beginning. Thaddeus had won Skyline Air, but the fight for true transformation was only just beginning. The entrenched powers of the aviation industry weren't ready to accept a world where everyone had equal opportunities. To own the skies, I have to change the world beneath them. Thaddeus Cross knew the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but his dream was now a reality, and he wasn't going to stop. A few years later, Thaddeus Cross becomes a symbol of success. At the International Aviation Future Conference in New York, the grand auditorium in the heart of the city was filled with the most powerful figures in the aviation industry. Bright lights illuminated the stage, casting a glow on the banners that read, "Future of Aviation, a New Horizon." The atmosphere was solemn, yet charged with anticipation. Aviation leaders, investors, and pilots from across the globe awaited the arrival of a special speaker. Backstage, Thaddeus Cross stood quietly, adjusting his black tie. Dressed in a sleek black suit and polished leather shoes, he exuded the poise and refinement of someone who had not only achieved success, but redefined it. An assistant approached, offering a reassuring smile. "Are you ready, Mr. Cross?" Thaddeus nodded, his eyes steady with confidence. "This is the moment I've been waiting for," he thought. "This isn't just about my success. It's about the future of aviation." The host stepped onto the stage and began the introduction. "Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is someone who has reshaped how we perceive aviation. A person who has proven that dreams can transcend all barriers. Please welcome Thaddeus Cross, CEO of Skyline Air and founder of the Freedom Flight Initiative." The auditorium erupted into applause. Thaddeus walked slowly onto the stage, the lights highlighting his confident and commanding presence. The applause swelled as he reached the podium. Standing before it, he looked out at the audience, many of whom had once doubted or dismissed him. Now, they gazed at him with admiration and respect. Among them were those who had rejected him in his early meetings. But today, they couldn't deny that Thaddeus had made history. Placing both hands on the podium, Thaddeus scanned the room, taking a deep breath before speaking in a voice that was strong and inspiring. Once, people said the skies were reserved for a select few. The room fell silent. But today, he continued, his tone unwavering. "I stand here to tell you that the skies belong to all of us." The silence deepened as every eye remained fixed on him, each listener hanging on his words. Thaddeus stepped away from the podium, moving closer to the audience as though bridging the gap between himself and the people before him. "I'm not here to talk about my own success," he said, pausing for effect. "I'm here to talk about change, about breaking down the barriers that have held this industry back for too long, about opening doors for the next generation." He turned, facing the powerful figures seated before him. "When I was a boy, I had no one to guide me. I grew up in a community where dreams were often crushed by harsh realities." He walked back to the podium, his steps deliberate, his words measured. "But I learned that we don't have to wait for someone to open the door for us." He stopped, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "We can open that door ourselves. And when we do, we have a responsibility to keep it open for those who come after us." The room was still, the audience captivated. Executives and investors who had once dismissed him now nodded in agreement. One leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "He's talking about something bigger than profits. He's talking about the future of aviation." Thaddeus returned to the podium, his voice rising with conviction. "We stand at a pivotal crossroads in aviation history. We can choose to keep things the way they've always been, closed and conservative." He paused, his piercing gaze sweeping across the room. "Or we can choose a new path, one where anyone can take to the skies, no matter who they are or where they come from." He lifted his head, his eyes focused firmly ahead. "The future of aviation doesn't lie in the planes we build. It lies in the people we empower." As Thaddeus concluded his speech, the audience rose to their feet, applause roaring through the auditorium. The ovation echoed like a declaration that a new era had begun. From the front row, Benjamin Langston stood, his eyes filled with pride. He looked at Thaddeus and gave a small, approving nod. In a shadowed corner of the room, Jared Monroe sat quietly, his expression contemplative. He was no longer at the helm of Skyline Air, but even he could see that a new world was taking shape. The stage lights blazed brightly, illuminating the grand auditorium where the International Aviation Future Conference was taking place. Thaddeus Cross stood at the center of the stage, his eyes radiating conviction and determination. Behind him, a vivid mural of a boundless blue sky symbolized a world free of barriers and prejudice. He paused for a moment, letting his gaze sweep across the audience. The applause thundered on, yet Thaddeus knew his journey didn't end here. A side door on the stage slowly opened. Young pilots stepped forward, dressed in deep blue flight uniforms that symbolized hope and determination. They marched onto the stage, forming a proud line behind Thaddeus, their eyes gleaming with pride. These were the graduates of the nonprofit Freedom Flight Initiative, the very people Thaddeus had trained and guided into the aviation industry. They were living proof of the change Thaddeus had worked so tirelessly to achieve. The audience rose to their feet in unison, applause echoing through the auditorium. Eyes that had once held doubt now brimmed with admiration and respect. They realized Thaddeus's story wasn't just about him. It was about a future where anyone could own the skies. The young pilot standing on the stage represented a new era, one unshackled by race or origin. A veteran investor leaned toward the person beside him and whispered, "This isn't just a historic moment. This is a true revolution." Thaddeus stepped forward, facing the entire room. His voice rang out, strong and inspiring. "I once heard people say my dreams were foolish." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. They said someone like me could never own the skies. He paused, his gaze turning to the young pilot standing behind him. "But today, I stand here to tell you this. With courage and vision, anyone can change the world." He took a deep breath, his eyes blazing with determination. "And change the skies." The applause erupted again. Leaders, investors, and pilots from across the globe stood, their applause a resounding declaration of a new era. Thaddeus turned to look at the mural of the blue sky behind him. In his eyes was a pride, not only for what he had accomplished, but for the doors he had opened for others. He stepped down from the stage and walked toward the young pilots of the Freedom Flight Initiative. Placing a hand on the shoulder of one young man, he smiled. "Now it's your turn," he said. The young pilots looked at him with admiration and gratitude. They knew a door had been opened, and they would never let it close again. Years later, the name Thaddeus Cross would still be spoken as a symbol of resilience and courage. In aviation classrooms, his story was told as proof that change is possible if you dare to dream and fight for that dream. At conferences large and small, the image of Thaddeus standing alongside the young pilots of the Freedom Flight Initiative became a beacon of hope and progress. A young boy stood by a window, gazing up at the endless blue sky, dreaming of the day he too would soar. The voice of a teacher echoed in the classroom. "Remember the story of Thaddeus Cross. He didn't just own the skies, he changed the world." Thaddeus Cross's story is proof that, with courage and vision, anyone can change the world and the skies. Thaddeus Cross's journey is only the beginning. Want to uncover more inspiring stories? Hit subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's soar higher together.